Before the ships came, before the world was divided by greed and violence, there existed something pure and untouched by the darkness that would follow. Before the shackles were forged in distant lands, before iron became the symbol of stolen freedom, Africa stood sovereign and proud under its own sun. Before the maps were drawn by foreign hands, before borders carved kingdoms into pieces, before empires decided who owned what, there was simply land and people. There was a land where the wind moved freely across endless plains, where the horizon stretched so far it seemed to touch eternity itself without interruption. This land was untouched by chains, unmarked by the cruelty that would soon sweep across it like a plague carried on the wind of conquest. Silence, the sound of wind across ancient earth, the breath of a continent that remembers everything, forgets nothing and waits for justice. And in this land, there were kings, not just rulers, but men who embodied the soul of their people, the strength of their ancestors, men of power who understood that true authority comes not from fear, but from the love and respect of those you serve with wisdom, men of civilization who built cities that rivaled anything the world had ever seen, structures of beauty and purpose that still stand today, men of wealth whose treasuries overflowed with gold, whose trade routes connected continents, whose economies made kingdoms across the sea envious and desperate, and men of courage who would face the greatest evil the world had ever known and refused to surrender their dignity, their people, their souls. They stood tall when the world tried to make them kneel. They stood firm when empires came with guns and lies and promises of partnership. The drums beat, the rhythm of resistance, the heartbeat of a people who knew their worth could never be measured by the chains meant to bind them. And when the chains came, carried across oceans by men who had forgotten their own humanity in pursuit of profit, these kings made a choice. They refused to kneel. They looked slavery in the face and said no. They chose war over surrender, death over dishonor, resistance over acceptance. Africa was not a land of chaos, as the history books written by conquerors would claim. It was not savage or uncivilized or waiting for rescue. It was a land of empires, of kingdoms older than the nations that would try to claim them, of systems of government and law and justice, of wealth beyond imagination, where gold was so abundant it was woven into cloth, where trade made cities prosper, where economies flourished without exploitation, of culture rich and deep, where music and art and dance told stories, where oral traditions preserved history, where identity was sacred and protected, and of knowledge that would astound the world, mathematics and astronomy and medicine and philosophy developed independently and brilliantly over centuries of dedication, words that carried wisdom across generations, proverbs and teachings that shaped societies, languages complex and beautiful, oral libraries vast and detailed beyond modern comprehension, knowledge preserved for generations in the minds of griots and scholars, in manuscripts carefully written and protected, in universities that predated Europe's greatest institutions. A university before its time stood in Timbuktu, where 25,000 students studied law and medicine and astronomy and mathematics under African scholars, where minds were sharpened through rigorous debate and study, where learning was valued above all else, where knowledge was seen as a path to enlightenment. They studied the heavens with instruments they created, mapped the stars, understood celestial movements, and used this knowledge to navigate trade routes and mark seasons. And they built civilizations that lasted centuries, cities of stone and mud, brick and wood, architectural marvels that required engineering knowledge and artistic vision. They mastered trade with such skill that their currencies were accepted across 3 continents. Their markets were meeting points for the known world. Connecting worlds that Europeans claimed they discovered, African traders have been traveling those routes for centuries, building relationships, exchanging goods and ideas and culture. Messages travel far across deserts and rivers and mountains through sophisticated relay systems, connecting kingdoms and networks of communication that rivaled anything in existence. Knowledge passed on from teacher to student in formal schools and informal apprenticeships, ensuring that skills and wisdom survive beyond any individual lifetime. They shaped their future with intention and vision, planning cities, developing agriculture, creating art, building societies based on principles of justice and community responsibility. Through rivers of trade that flowed like arteries across the continent, goods and people and ideas moved, creating wealth and connection and mutual prosperity. This was Africa, not the Africa of stereotypes and lies, but the real Africa of complexity and brilliance and humanity in all its messy glory. A land of kings who ruled with wisdom and sometimes with force, who built and protected and passed on legacies that would survive even slavery's attempt at erasure. And then the world came for it. Europe, hungry and desperate and convinced of its own superiority, looked at Africa and saw only resources to plunder. His name was Sundiata Keita, and his story begins not with strength but with weakness, not with power but with mockery and pain. A child born into struggle, unable to walk while other children ran, mocked by those who could not see past his physical limitations to the spirit within. Yet his mother saw what others could not. She saw a destiny. She saw greatness. She saw a future king in a boy who could barely stand. She spoke destiny into his bones with every word of encouragement, every refusal to give up. Every moment she chose faith over despair and hope over resignation. And one day, gripping an iron rod with determination born of years of humiliation and his mother's unwavering belief, he pulled himself up and rose. He trained without mercy, pushing his body beyond what others thought possible, proving that limitation is often just lack will disguise as impossibility, until weakness became strength, until the legs that could not walk carried him into battle, until the boy became a warrior and then a king. The boy they mocked for his disability became a man they feared on the battlefield, the leader they followed into impossible victories against overwhelming odds. Wearing the lion skin cape that symbolizes strength and courage, he transformed from victim to victor, from powerless to powerful, from forgotten to legendary. And soon he became a king who would unite fractured kingdoms into an empire, who would bring peace where there was war, prosperity where there was poverty. Then came a king unlike any other, a ruler whose wealth was so vast that historians still struggle to calculate it in modern terms. A king of unimaginable wealth whose treasury contained more gold than entire European kingdoms had seen, whose generosity would literally change economies across continents. Mansa Musa, the name that would be whispered in awe across the world. The king who proved African wealth was not a myth but reality. A ruler guided by faith who saw his wealth not as his own, but as a trust from God to be used for good and for the glory of Islam. And power that came not just from gold but from wisdom, from the ability to govern diverse peoples, from understanding that true leadership serves rather than dominates. He ruled an empire that stretched across West Africa, controlling trade routes, cities, resources, and the lives of millions who looked to him for protection and justice. Overflowing with riches that seemed endless, gold mines that produced wealth generation after generation, economies that functioned smoothly under his wise administration and vision. And he would carry it across the Sahara Desert in the most famous pilgrimage in history, a journey that would announce Mali's wealth to the world. Across the desert where many died, where heat and thirst and distance defeated armies, he led 60,000 people safely, protecting them with planning and resources. A king the world would never forget, whose image would appear on medieval European maps holding gold, whose story would be told for centuries as legend. And then a queen rose who would prove that courage has no gender, that warfare is not only for men, that leadership requires brains more than brawn. A warrior who understood strategy and tactics, who could outthink her enemies even when she could not overpower them, who turned weakness into strength through intelligence, who would not bow to Portuguese demands, who refused to accept subjugation, who looked colonizers in the eye and declared herself their equal, not their inferior. She commanded loyalty through respect earned in battle and in council, through wisdom demonstrated in negotiation and in war, through consistent defense of her people's freedom, and strategy that confused and frustrated European forces accustomed to conventional warfare, guerrilla tactics that used the land itself as a weapon against invaders. She moved like the storm, unpredictable and unstoppable, appearing where least expected, striking before enemies could prepare, disappeared before they could retaliate effectively. Into the enemy's world she went without fear, walking into Portuguese halls as an equal, negotiating treaties as a sovereign, demanding respect that was reluctantly given, and refused humiliation when they offered her no chair, using her attendant as a throne, teaching them that respect cannot be withheld, only demanded and taken. She stood as equal to men who thought themselves superior, proving through presence and intelligence that their assumptions about African women were lies built on ignorance, silence. The moment power shifts, The instant when the colonizer realizes the colonized will not cooperate in their own oppression or accept their assigned inferiority. Some stories begin in chains and the horror of human beings sold as property, in the nightmare of slavery that stole millions of African lives. A boy watching everything, enslaved but not broken, observing the system that held him captive, learning his weaknesses, planning his escape into power. Silent observation, patient calculation, the gathering of knowledge that would later become weapons more powerful than any gun or sword could ever be. He studied the system of slavery and trade, understanding that knowledge is power, that the same mechanisms of oppression could be turned into tools of liberation. So one day he could master it, so he could rise from enslaved person to trader to king, so he could prove that birth does not determine destiny. They laughed at him when he could not walk, when his legs would not obey his will. We seemed destined for irrelevance and pity, but his mother never did. She saw beyond the moment, beyond the limitation, beyond the mockery to the man he would become if he refused to surrender. And when he stood for first time, gripping the iron rod with desperate determination, pulling himself upright against gravity and expectation and cruel laughter, everything changed. Everything changed. The boy who could not walk would walk into history. The child mocked would become the legend studied. Weakness transformed into unstoppable strength. He trained his body beyond what seemed possible, lifting stones, throwing spears, running distances, building the physical strength that would carry him into battle and victory, and sharpen his skill with weapons and strategy, learning from warriors, practicing until excellence became instinct, until he moved with deadly precision and grace, with discipline that never wavered even when exhausted, that pushed through pain and doubt, that refused to accept limitation as permanent or insurmountable truth, and wisdom gained from elders who taught him history and law and governance, who prepared him not just to fight, but to rule justly and wisely. He united kingdoms fractured by rivalry and war, bringing together different peoples under one vision of prosperity and peace, creating Mali through diplomacy and force, into one force that could resist external threats, that could control trade routes, that could build monuments to African achievement that would last for centuries. A storm was coming. The storm of Sundiata's army, disciplined and motivated, fighting not for conquest, but for liberation, for unity, for a future worth building. The drums beat with the rhythm of war, calling warriors to battle, synchronizing movement, intimidating enemies, celebrating victories, mourning losses, marking history with sound. And at Karina, on the battlefield that would determine Mali's future, where Sundiata faced a sorcerer king who would terrorize the region for years, the battle began. The battle began with cavalry charges that shook the earth, with arrows that darkened the sky, with a clash of weapons and the cries of warriors fighting for freedom. Steel met strength on that field, discipline met desperation, strategy met sorcery, and for hours the outcome hung in balance as both sides gave everything. And Sundiata led from the front, not cowering in safety, but fighting alongside his men, inspiring them with his courage, directing them with his tactical genius. The empire of the Sorcerer King fell that day, defeated not by magic but by organization, by unity, by the determination of free people fighting oppression. And a new one rose from its ashes, Mali, the empire that would become synonymous with African wealth and power and cultural achievement for centuries. Mali was born in blood and battle, in the determination of people who refused to accept tyranny, in the vision of a king who saw beyond war to peace. And it flourished under Sundiata's wise rule. Trade expanded, cities grew, arts thrived, learning was encouraged, justice was administered, and prosperity touched even common people. Trade expanded along routes secured by Mali's army. Goods flowed from the coast to the interior, from the Sahara to the forests, connecting economies and cultures. And prosperity followed as markets flourished, as craftsmen found customers, as farmers fed cities, as merchants grew wealthy, as Mali's reputation attracted scholars and traders. The boy who could not walk built an empire that would outlast him by centuries, proving that greatness has nothing to do with how you start. Became a king remembered not just for conquest, but for bringing order out of chaos, prosperity out of poverty, unity out of division, hope out of despair. The Lion of Mali, the title that captured his fierce courage, his royal authority, his transformation from weak child to powerful king who defended his people. In 1324, Mansa Musa, the grandnephew of Sundiata, decided to fulfill the Muslim obligation of Hajj, to make pilgrimage to Mecca as his faith required. A king prepared not just for spiritual journey, but for political statement, to show the world that Africa was not poor or uncivilized, but magnificent, to carry unimaginable wealth across desert and foreign lands, gold in quantities that would shock and transform every economy it touched along the route. Across the desert where lesser caravans perished, where water was scarce and bandits common, and heat deadly, Musa would travel in safety and splendor. 60,000 souls made the journey with him, soldiers and servants and scholars and family, the largest pilgrimage caravan in history, moving like a nation against the elements of Sahara heat and sandstorms, against bandits and desert creatures, against thirst and exhaustion. They moved with discipline and preparation and faith, carrying gold beyond measure, hundreds of pounds of it, dozens of camels loaded with it, more than Cairo had seen in decades, arriving all at once. A king humble before God despite his earthly power, praying 5 times daily, fasting, seeking forgiveness, remembering that wealth means nothing in the eyes of the divine. When he arrived in Cairo, the city's economy was about to experience something it had never seen before and would never see again in its history. He gave freely to everyone he met, to beggars and scholars, to mosque attendants and government officials, distributing gold with such generosity it seemed inexhaustible, and changed an economy forever as a sudden influx of gold caused immediate inflation. The price of gold dropped by 25%, taking years to recover. The price of gold collapsed because supply overwhelmed demand, because Musa's generosity exceeded anything the market could absorb. Proving wealth is relative to scarcity. Market instability followed as merchants struggled with new prices, as traders adjusted to new realities, as Cairo learned that even gold can lose value. He reached Mecca after months of travel, having distributed wealth across North Africa, having made Mali's name famous, having changed history through generosity, and bowed in worship at the Kaaba, fulfilling his religious obligation, praying for guidance and forgiveness, humbling himself before God regardless of his earthly glory. He returned to Mali changed by pilgrimage, more committed to Islam, determined to spread education, ready to build monuments to learning and faith, bringing knowledge in the form of scholars and architects and books, importing expertise to build mosques and universities that would make Timbuktu a center of learning, and build a golden age where Sankore University attracted students from across the Islamic world, where books were valued above gold, where learning flourished. Mali became the center of the world for Islamic scholarship in West Africa, a place where knowledge was pursued, preserved, and passed on to future generations. The richest man in history, whose wealth has been estimated at 400 billion in modern terms, whose generosity was legendary, whose faith guided his rule. In 1622, a queen named Zinga walked into a Portuguese hall to negotiate for her people's freedom, for peace, for respect that seemed impossible. A queen walked into power wielding nothing but intelligence and courage, facing an empire with only her wits and her absolute refusal to be intimidated. They tried to humiliate her by providing no chair, by forcing her to stand while they sat, by treating her as inferior, by denying her basic diplomatic courtesy. But she answered their disrespect with display of royal authority that left them speechless, turning their insult into a demonstration of her absolute confidence, with power demonstrated by sitting on her attendant's back as if it were a throne, treating the chair problem as beneath her notice, maintaining dignity. She looked the Portuguese governor in the eye as an equal, never flinching, never lowering her gaze, demanding respect through presence and unshakable self-assurance, and unsettled the room full of men who expected submission, who thought African women would be easy to manipulate, who discovered they had gravely miscalculated. She had already won the psychological battle before negotiations even began, establishing herself as formidable opponent worthy of respect and careful handling rather than dismissal. But she knew that diplomacy with the Portuguese was temporary, that ultimately they wanted conquest, not partnership, that war was inevitable regardless of agreements signed. War was coming because Europeans saw negotiation as weakness, saw African sovereignty as obstacle, saw land and people as resources to exploit, not equals to respect. And when it came, she was ready, having prepared her people, having trained warriors, having built alliances, Having studied Portuguese tactics and weaknesses, she led from the front of her armies, not sending others to die while she remained safe, but fighting alongside her soldiers, sharing their risks. She played politics with skill, aligned with Dutch against Portuguese, with Portuguese against Dutch, using European rivalries to maintain Angolan independence for decades, and mastered war through guerrilla tactics that frustrated European forces, through strategic retreats and ambushes, through using terrain and knowledge of land against invaders. For 30 years she held them back, preventing Portuguese complete conquest of Angola, defending her people's freedom against overwhelming odds and superior weapons. She fought for 30 years without surrender, without giving up, without accepting defeat, maintaining resistance when others would have despaired and submitted to colonial rule. She grew older but never weaker, her strategic mind sharp until the end, her determination undiminished, her commitment to freedom absolute and unwavering. But never weaker in spirit or tactical skill, still commanding respect, still inspiring warriors, still defending independence, still refusing to bow to Portuguese demands. Her scars told the story of a lifetime of resistance, of battles fought and won and lost, of prices paid for freedom, of suffering endured for principle, of a queen who never bowed to anyone, who maintained dignity and sovereignty until her death, who proved that courage is not the absence of fear, but action despite it. His story began in chains in the Niger Delta, where he was enslaved as a young man, where his humanity was denied, where his future seemed predetermined. Silence, the weight of shackles, the sound of humanity being bought and sold, the moment when a person becomes property in the eyes of the law. But he was watching everything with eyes that saw beyond the present moment, that analyzed the system, that looked for weaknesses to exploit, learning the system of trade and slavery from the inside, understanding how power worked, who had it, how it flowed, where its vulnerabilities existed, from within the nightmare of his own enslavement, gathering knowledge that would later become his path to freedom and then to power beyond his captor's imagination. He understood power came from controlling resources, not from violence, from monopolizing trade, not from military might, from being indispensable to economies that needed what you controlled, and built influence slowly and carefully, starting as trader, then as successful merchant, then as controller of palm oil trade that Europeans desperately needed. Control of trade in palm oil and other goods became his weapon against the British Empire, his tool for independence. His path to sovereignty and respect became his weapon more powerful than any army because Europeans needed his cooperation, depended on his goodwill, could not simply conquer what they needed to negotiate for. He stood firm when British merchants tried to bypass him, when they demanded lower prices, when they insisted on terms that would have undermined his power. As a king ruling his own state of Opobo, independent from both traditional rulers and colonial powers, creating sovereignty through economic leverage and strategic intelligence, he built his own empire from nothing, from enslavement to kingship, from powerlessness to power, from victim to victor through patience and strategic brilliance, from nothing but his own intelligence and determination, creating something where before there was only servitude, building power where before there was only oppression. He challenged the British Empire itself, refusing to submit to their trade demands, maintaining independence when others capitulated, defending his people's economic interests, and paid the price when the British kidnapped him during treaty negotiations, when they exiled him to the West Indies, when they destroyed what he had built. The Ashanti men hesitated when the British demanded their surrender, when colonial troops surrounded their capital, when the choice seemed to be between death and dishonor. Chiefs sat in fearful silence, weighing options that all seemed to lead to defeat, considering surrender that would preserve lives but destroy their nation's soul. But she did not hesitate for a moment. Queen Mother Sanwa, who saw clearly that some things are worth dying for, that freedom matters more than survival. If you will not fight, then step aside, she told the men, her voice cutting through their fear and indecision like a blade through cloth. I will lead the warriors myself, this elderly woman declared, shaming younger men with her courage, proving that leadership is about spirit, not physical strength. Silence as men absorbed the rebuke, as shame mixed with inspiration. As her words ignited courage, they thought they had lost the fear of British guns. Ashanti warriors rose to follow her, shamed into action by a woman's courage, inspired by her refusal to surrender, choosing honor over survival, Resistance over submission. The army mobilized under a command, gathering weapons and warriors, preparing defenses, organizing attacks, demonstrating that age and gender do not determine military leadership ability. War preparation became intense as they sharpened weapons, stockpiled supplies, prepared defenses, trained fighters, organized strategy, all under direction of an elderly woman. The siege of Kumasi began with her forces attacking the British fort, catching colonizers off guard, proving that Africans would not simply accept conquest without resistance. Attacks came to force using terrain and knowledge of land to ambush British forces, to harass supply lines, to make occupation costly and dangerous. Close combat demonstrated Ashanti fighting skill and courage, warriors engaging British soldiers in hand-to-hand fighting, proving themselves equals despite technological disadvantage on the battlefield. Sanwa commanded troops with strategic brilliance, directing attacks, coordinating defenses, maintaining morale, proving that military leadership requires intelligence, not just physical strength or male gender. British forces mounted their defense, but struggled against guerrilla tactics, against an enemy that appeared and disappeared, against warriors fighting for their homeland and freedom. The capture of Sanwa came after months of resistance, after she had proven that Ashanti would not submit easily, after she had inspired resistance that continued beyond her. But they never took the soul of the Ashanti nation, never captured the golden stool that symbolized her sovereignty, never broke the spirit of resistance she embodied. The Zulu kingdom demonstrated that African military organization could defeat European armies, that tactical genius could overcome technological advantage, that courage could triumph over supposedly superior firepower. Zulu army formations moved with disciplined precision, warriors organized in regiments, executing complex maneuvers, demonstrating that African militaries were sophisticated and professional, not primitive mobs. Close-up of shields and assegais showed the weapons that, in skilled hands, could defeat British rifles. That traditional did not mean ineffective. That technology alone does not determine victory. Setchweo addresses army before the Battle of Isanuna, inspiring warriors, organizing strategy, demonstrating leadership that would lead to one of Britain's worst military defeats in history. British forces crossed into Zulu territory confident of easy victory, underestimating their opponents, unprepared for the tactical sophistication they would face, about to learn a costly lesson at Isanuna battlefield. 20,000 Zulu warriors faced British forces equipped with modern rifles and artillery, seemingly outmatched but fighting for their homeland with superior numbers and tactics. The Zulu charge became legendary, warriors advancing in disciplined formation despite rifle fire, overwhelming British positions through courage and tactical coordination, proving African military excellence. British military forces collapsed under Zulu assault. Over 1,300 soldiers killed, weapons and supplies captured, confidence shattered in a single afternoon of devastating defeat. The battlefield aftermath showed the price both sides paid, bodies of brave men who fought for their nations, evidence that war is horror regardless of who wins. Setchweo understood that winning one battle did not win a war, that British would return with more troops, that ultimate victory might be impossible, but resistance still mattered. Samori Touré's empire defended itself through strategic brilliance and scorched earth tactics, through weapons manufacturing and military innovation, through absolute refusal to surrender to French colonial ambitions. His weapons forges produced rifles and ammunition, demonstrating that Africans could master modern military technology, could manufacture their own weapons, could compete with European industrial capacity on smaller scale. War councils planned strategy for resisting French expansion, coordinating military campaigns, organizing economic support for war effort, demonstrating sophisticated understanding of modern warfare requirements beyond battlefield tactics. Strategic planning involved moving his entire empire when threatened, evacuating populations, relocating industries, maintaining organized resistance while retreating, confusing and frustrating French forces expecting conventional warfare. The migration of entire populations under Samori's order showed commitment to resistance over territory, willingness to sacrifice land to preserve independence, strategic flexibility that confused European expectations. Cities burned under scorched earth policy, denying resources to advancing French forces, making occupation costly and difficult, demonstrating that retreat could be tactical weapon rather than defeat. Guerrilla ambushes harassed French supply lines, made occupation dangerous and expensive, prevented consolidation of colonial control, extended resistance beyond what seemed possible given disparity in resources and technology. French forces eventually wore down Samoa's resistance through superior resources and reinforcements, through alliance with his enemies, through persistence that African resistance could not indefinitely match. Samoa's capture ended 18 years of resistance that cost France dearly, that had inspired other resistors, that had proven African military capability and determination. Empty battlefields at sunrise told stories of blood spilled, of courage demonstrated, of resistance that mattered even when it ultimately failed to prevent colonization. Dawn prayer under ancient trees connected warriors to spiritual strength, to ancestors who fought before them, to God who sees all struggles and judges all oppressors. Silhouettes praying at sunrise showed that faith sustained resistance, that spiritual conviction gave courage, that belief in justice beyond this world enabled sacrifices in this one. Kings in prayer demonstrated that leadership included humility before God, that power on earth meant nothing without spiritual grounding, that wisdom came from acknowledging dependence on divine guidance. Hands raised in supplication to God for strength, for guidance, for justice, for victory, or for courage to face defeat with dignity and maintain faith. Broken chains glowing with divine light symbolize that ultimately freedom comes from God, not from military victory, that spiritual liberation precedes physical liberation, that faith breaks chains weapons cannot. Battlefield prayers before combat acknowledge that victory belongs to God, that warriors fight but outcome depends on divine will, that courage comes from faith not from weapons. Scripture scrolls reminded warriors of divine justice, of God's hatred of oppression, of promises that tyranny will not last forever, that justice will ultimately prevail. Tears on warrior faces showed that courage does not mean absence of fear or grief, that strong men cry, that fighting for justice involves emotional cost. Light breaking through clouds symbolized hope that persists despite darkness, that God's presence sustains even in defeat, that dawn always follows night no matter how long. God was never on the side of chains or slavery or oppression, never blessed conquest or cruelty, never sanctioned theft of land or lives or freedom. Modern Africans at sunrise represent continuation of resistance, inheritance of courage from ancestors, responsibility to honor sacrifices by maintaining dignity and demanding justice in new forms. Cultural diversity across African continent demonstrates that unity does not require uniformity, that strength comes from celebrating difference, that Pan-African identity embraces multiplicity. Faces in close-up reveal humanity that slavery tried to deny, individuality that colonization tried to erase, dignity that resistance preserved across generations of oppression. Split screen of chains versus freedom shows ongoing struggle, reminds us that liberation is process not event, that freedom must be defended in every generation. Montage of Kings demonstrates that resistance took many forms, that leadership emerged in different contexts, that courage manifested in various ways, all aimed at preserving dignity. Symbolic artifacts of resistance, weapons, crowns, documents, chains, tell stories of struggle, preserve memory of those who fought, inspire continued resistance against modern forms of oppression. Chains dissolving into light symbolize ultimate defeat of oppression, triumph of human spirit over cruelty, promise that freedom will prevail even when temporarily delayed. Open path ahead represents future possibilities, freedom to choose, opportunities created by ancestors' sacrifices, responsibility to build something worthy of what they endured. Sunrise expanding across Africa symbolizes hope rising, new day beginning, future being created, promise that yesterday's chains will not determine tomorrow's possibilities or limit potential. King silhouettes against horizon remind us that they still watch, that ancestors witness our choices, that their sacrifices demand that we live worthy of their courage. Hands breaking final chains show that liberation is active process requiring participation, that freedom is seized not granted, that every generation must fight its own battles. Chain falling to earth represents oppression defeated, tyranny overcome, human dignity restored, justice delayed but not ultimately denied by temporary power of oppressors. Golden light filling frame symbolizes divine justice, hope realized, freedom achieved, promise fulfilled that those who struggle for righteousness will ultimately see victory even if beyond their lifetime. Thanks for watching. If the story stirs something in you, please subscribe to Slave Memory Chronicles. The channel is committed to telling these histories, preserving memories that mainstream narratives tried to erase or diminish. The chains did not win. Despite centuries of trying, despite millions enslaved, despite kingdoms destroyed, the chains did not win because the spirit survived. The stories continued. The resistance never ended, and we are here today remembering, honoring, and continuing the struggle for dignity and justice that these kings began.